Hi, everyone. My name is Vivian Schick. I'm Senior Director of Marketing here at Bitwarden. In our digitally connected world, everything is vulnerable to cyber attacks, and it's been reported that between 2019 and 2020, nearly 600 towns, cities, and counties in the United States were hit by ransomware attacks, shutting down hospitals, police departments, businesses, and more. How the US went from being the leader and having the strongest cyber arsenal to becoming so vulnerable to cyber attacks and espionage, and how governments use hacking as a weapon of war are the themes of her book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce and welcome award-winning cybersecurity journalist from the New York Times, best-selling author, and someone whose work I've been personally following for many years, Nicole Perlroth.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I wish we could all do this in person, hopefully sometime soon.
Yes. I know you had to switch out your schedule, your travel schedule a little bit. So really appreciate you being with us live this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are.
I'm actually about to go to my first CISA advisory board meeting here in DC. So that's a pretty exciting development. This is a new advisory board that they put together, and we'll be having our first meeting tonight.
Oh, that's wonderful. You speak a lot about how governments and companies and individuals can be more involved in ensuring that we're just more protected online and more secure. Nicole, I'd love to just, get into your book. There's a couple of quotes in your book that just really stood out to me. You say, "The internet has no borders. No cyber attack can be confined to one nation's citizens anymore. The world is on the precipice of cyber catastrophe." Those are pretty chilling statements. Was that your intent in all of this?
It was by the end. And there's a reason why I called this book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. And it is as much a story, I think, of the last decade of cyber threats and how they've advanced. But I also think it's the story of my own personal journey in coming to that conclusion. So when you join the New York Times as the cybersecurity beat reporter, you will get inundated with thousands of emails every day from every security company telling you that we are on the precipice of a digital Pearl Harbor. And you hear it from government officials. I talk in the book about how it almost became a joke because I would always say, "So how far off are we?" And the answer was always the same: 18 to 24 months, just close enough to give it urgency, just far enough away that I might not hold them to these predictions if they didn't come true. And what I realized over the last decade, and really in doing this deep dive through the book, is we're almost in a worse place than just one incident like the digital Pearl Harbor event. We are really in a place of death by 1,000 cuts. Our intellectual property has been stolen left and right over the past decade plus. We have caught Russian hackers in our power plants. We've caught them probing our nuclear plants. And with SolarWinds, they found a way to embed in our government communication channels, and they're still not out. And now with ransomware, we are seeing ransomware hit our critical infrastructure. Just this week, it was announced that there was a major electric utility in Colorado that fell victim to a pretty big ransomware attack. And while it didn't hit the grid, it basically decimated decades worth of data and consumer contacts, et cetera. So it's not good. And in some ways, the reason I really don't like the digital Pearl Harbor analogy is because I do think it's a distraction from where we are now, which is more of this death by 1,000 cuts. The other thing that's wrong with the digital Pearl Harbor analogy is we didn't see those planes coming to Pearl Harbor. We've seen this coming for a very, very long time. There have been warnings that there could be some kind of calamitous cyber-induced attack for almost as long as the internet has been in creation. And at this point, everyone is embedded in everyone's systems. That is the conclusion I've come to in doing this book and in reporting on these topics for the New York Times. We're all just sort of sitting around waiting for the right geopolitical trigger for someone to actually pull the button and do something calamitous using the access they already have. And so, yes, my goal with this book was to wake everyone up, not just the usual suspects they already know, but to wake up people like my mom, to wake
Yeah.
up, everyday lay people, because this is a real whole of society problem, and if I'm guilty of anything, I think in the pages of the New York Times, it was leaving people with this impression that this is a government problem. This is a warplane fighting exercise, a military problem. And that's just not the case. This is a business problem, and this is an everyday people problem. We are still not employing cyber hygiene the ways
Yeah.
that we need to.
Yeah. And you mentioned, the analogy between this and the cyber Pearl Harbor. Last year or this past year, we saw the Colonial Pipeline, solar winds. This week, I read that the same hackers involved in the solar winds supply chain attack, which was one of the worst data breaches in modern history, that these hackers are still active and growing. In your book, you talk about how countries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea have now infiltrated the computer systems that run some of our country's most important infrastructure, not just power grids, but hospitals and nuclear plants and dams. Why does this keep happening? When we started as the most sophisticated cyber power in the world, our conventional arsenal has been somewhat effective in scaring off would-be attackers. Why has the same logic not applied in the cyber realm?
So I still think that the United States is the top dog when it comes to offense. I think that nobody has pulled off anything close to StuxNet, the attack that the US and Israelis pulled off on Iran's nuclear facility. The problem is that they're getting closer. It's not just solar winds, which fortunately we know to be the SVR and not the GRU, which is the elite group of Russian hackers that's actually gone and turned off the lights and used their access for sabotage. It's the SVR, which is probably Russia's best team of hackers, but they are more of the classic espionage variety. What we have, our offensive stockpile of cyber weapons, our demonstration of our capabilities with StuxNet, unfortunately, it has not been a deterrent. And if anything, it really showed the world what was possible with code, not just for espionage, but for destruction. And since StuxNet got out 11 years ago, every country has been working to stockpile their own offensive capabilities, maybe with the exception of Antarctica. Someone recently added the Vatican to my list. But every country is now in this game, and they see the possibilities of code in ways that we never really imagined. Our adversaries in particular know that they might never be able to match the United States in terms of our conventional military spending. But they can do a lot of harm when it comes to cyber attacks. And that is really where we underestimated our adversaries. The year that StuxNet got out, that same year, there was a national intelligence estimate, which is a classified document I was able to get access to when I looked through some of the documents associated with the Snowden trove. And it was a classified national intelligence estimate from that year. And what it said was that Russia was considered to be our top adversary in terms of sophistication of their cyber capabilities. And then there was China, which was deemed less sophisticated, but the more immediate threat because they were so brazen, mainly with how they were hacking our intellectual property. And then below China, there was this gap. And US intelligence agencies basically concluded that countries like Iran and North Korea, while they had the will to acquire these capabilities and to do the US harm with cyber attacks, they lacked the skill sets and the
Yeah.
actual tools. And everyone I have interviewed who was associated with that conclusion 10, 11 years ago now fully admits that they were wrong. Because 2 years later, hackers from Iran came and decimated 30,000 computers at Saudi Aramco and replaced all of their data with an image of a burning American flag. And what that showed our intelligence community was you don't need a StuxNet to do serious damage. You just need rudimentary wiping code,
Mhm.
deletion code. And so that's what's been happening. And I'm not really, I wasn't really the cybersecurity reporter at the New York Times. I was the digital espionage and digital sabotage reporter at the New York Times because that's what I ended up spending all
Yeah.
of my time doing. And so, okay, our offensive capabilities are not a deterrent. Uh, but we've chosen to act like that is the best defense, an active defense, as Paul Nakasone calls it. But we know with SolarWinds, it's not enough. The NSA missed SolarWinds. We only know about SolarWinds because the SVR made the critical mistake of hacking Mandiant, and then in unrolling their own breach, discovered that
Mhm.
they had come in through the SolarWinds software update and were able to raise the flag for everyone else. And oh, by the way, showed that Russia had actually staged their attack from inside the United States, from GoDaddy servers in New Jersey, where the NSA can't look. So they've really exploited our blind spot. And the other major blind spot that they've exploited is here in the United States, we're still acting like we're an island separated by two oceans. And on the internet, that's just simply not the case. And 85% of our critical infrastructure, as the stat goes, is in private sector hands. And anytime there has been any attempt to legislate that those businesses that run our dams, our nuclear plants, our power grid, our water treatment facilities meet a bare minimum standard of cybersecurity, it's been killed. And there are legitimate arguments to say, regulation is not the answer there. But I do think we've just basically been pleading with companies to please raise the bar when it comes to cybersecurity. And I don't think that we've adequately communicated the threat. And I don't think that these businesses understand that in the next major geopolitical conflict, they will probably unwittingly find themselves on the front line. And we've gotten glimpses of that, with the NotPetya attack, which wiped out Merck, wiped out their vaccine production systems. Imagine if something like that happened right now at Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson and Johnson.
Yeah.
I just don't think Americans have the capacity to understand, to imagine what that cyber conflict would look like.
Yeah. You mentioned StuxNet a few times just now, and for those of our audience members who may not be familiar with StuxNet or who may be too young to know StuxNet, a little bit of a history lesson. This happened about a decade ago, and I think from your book, or how you described it in your book, it really kind of thrusted the U.S. And its role in driving this cyber weapons arm race. Like it almost kind of started there in a way. And Stuxnet, for those of you who are not familiar, was a computer worm that the U.S. allegedly used to destroy Iranian centrifuges through their nuclear plant between the year of 2009 and 2010. And it was like the first time one government had really been able to digitally infiltrate the networks of another, and used its access not just for spying, but to really wreak physical damage. I just thought that was such a fascinating, how you presented that in your book was incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, and it started a little bit earlier. We don't know
Mhm.
the day
Yeah.
one I think it gets declassified in 2035, and I'll be the first one to go access that declassified report. But it was fascinating to go back to that little slice of history,
Yeah.
which doesn't feel like history because it wasn't that long ago. But 2006, it's interesting. I was actually working for Ted Kennedy at that time in his foreign policy office, and I remember that year very well because that was the year we were seeing the highest number of American soldiers come back in caskets from Iraq. We were overstretched in Afghanistan and Iraq. And in my reporting for the book, I interviewed a number of people who described what it was like to be in the administration then and to be at the NSA in particular, because Israel was pressuring the United States to hand over our bunker buster bombs, which is what they would have needed to really take out Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. And every simulation that was run at the Pentagon showed that if the United States, even if we just handed over these weapons and looked the other way, it didn't matter. We would get dragged into a third war with Iran, and we were already so overstretched. There was so little appetite for a third war in the Middle East that we might even lose it because we were so overstretched. And so George W. Bush famously said, "Get me a third option." And that third option came out of the NSA, and it was StuxNet. And the idea was, let's use code to mimic natural accidents that would happen at a nuclear enrichment facility. And that is what they did. And it was a bloody masterpiece. I mean, the code went in and basically got into the computers that control the speed of the rotors that spin the uranium centrifuges. And in some cases, it would speed them up, and then it would sit back for a number of weeks and do nothing. And it would go back in and slow them down and sit back for a couple of weeks and do nothing. And all the while, if you were an engineer at Natanz looking at your computer screen, everything appeared to be functioning normally. It had this Ocean's 11 quality to it.
Yeah.
But and it was a counter-proliferation effort. And really, the way I think about Stuxnet is it was the digital version of the Manhattan Project in reverse. It really was a bloody masterpiece. And it's very clear that someone's general counsel was standing over those programmers' shoulders, making sure that it only exacted destruction on the exact configuration of computers and centrifuges at Natanz. The problem is that it got out.
Yeah.
And we don't know exactly how it got out, but it zoomed around the world. It hit businesses all over Asia.
Yeah.
It came home to roost here. It hit Chevron, and it didn't do any damage because those cautionary elements had been baked into the code. But like I said, it showed the world what was possible.
Yeah.
And I think if you think about how quickly the US lost its first mover advantage in this space, then I think Stuxnet is a critical
Yeah.
chapter
Yeah.
in that story.
Yeah. And it definitely showed the kind of what happens when the same weapons that we use against our adversaries and how it can be turned against us.
Right. And this is where nuclear analogies really don't apply, because unlike nuclear weapons and nuclear models of deterrence, there's no fissile material required. You're talking about code. The barrier to entry is so low. And oh, by the way, if you use these weapons, it is entirely possible for the entire cybersecurity research community to unwind them, reverse engineer them, and for some of our adversaries to take bits and pieces and try and mimic them in their own attacks, like the attack on Saudi Aramco.
Yeah. One of the ways you tell your stories that I felt was so compelling was, you're talking about very technical topics. You're talking about machines and code and data, but really you tell these stories through very human stories throughout your book, and some really remarkable and funny and quirky characters. I loved your comparison of one of the bars that you went to and looking like the bar at Star Wars. I can't remember the exact name, but one of the stories that really kind of was incredibly powerful and heartbreaking to me personally was the human rights activist Ahmed Mansoor. And his story around just how cyber espionage is not just an inconvenience, or it's not just impacting companies, and it's maybe a loss of money, but it impacts human lives. I would love for you to share his story with this audience.
Yeah. So, and I say in the book, there really is not a day that goes by that I don't think about him and want to scream.
Yeah.
Um, I met Ahmed Mansoor because we first discovered, and when I say we, a friend and terrific forensic researcher, Bill Marczak, who's at Berkeley and Citizen Lab, discovered, I believe at that point it was Hacking Team or Gamma Group, I forget which one, these European spyware company. They had found evidence that his phones had been infected with this spyware, commercial spyware that's sold to governments. And so I interviewed him, and he lives in the United Arab Emirates, and we talked about, okay, well, what did this mean for you? And he talked about the fact that he had been beaten up twice, to the point of hospitalization, in random places that someone would only know he was there if they were tracking his phone, basically.
Yeah.
He had had his car stolen while he was at the police department. He'd had his bank account emptied out. He'd had his passport confiscated, so he couldn't leave even if he wanted to, and he didn't want to. That's really critical. I kept saying, how come you haven't gotten out? And he said, because what's the point? I am here to try and advocate for, and his big cause was expanding voting rights in the UAE. And he said, he couldn't live with himself if he left the UAE, but that he had really become a prisoner in his own home. He couldn't go anywhere. He was starting to worry about his children. His wife was constantly panicked. And I forget the exact quote, but I put it in that first story where he said, one day you might wake up and find that you've been labeled a terrorist despite the fact you don't even know how to operate a gun. And that always stuck with me because he represents who we could all become if we don't develop some kind of rules and norms and respect for human rights in the commercial spyware industry. And so, the last time we spoke, that was what he was describing, and he was really this poet. He loved poetry. He was sort of this philosopher. And the next time we spoke, we discovered NSO spyware on his phone. That spyware has really become headline grabbing over the last few years. I've written about it. Others have written and done terrific journalism around NSO. It's Pegasus software, which basically just embeds in your phone and gets everything off of your phone that you could not even imagine. They started calling him the $1 million dissident because that is how much money the UAE was apparently willing to spend to track his every word and movement. And since then, he made some sort of critical remark in a tweet, and he was arrested under some new law about criticizing the royal family on Twitter. And he's been in solitary confinement. And he's been in solitary confinement for the last couple of years, and he's been on hunger strikes. They've taken away his books, which is the part that I know probably tortures him the most. But he is just this living, breathing reminder of where the world could go, particularly in some of these states that we consider to be allies, but have a very different idea of what a terrorist is than we do. And it's just a big warning, I think, to everyone that we cannot continue to allow the commercial spyware industry to go unregulated.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that story, Ahmed's story, with us in your book. On the other end of the spectrum, in terms of the vivid characters in your book, are some of the hackers. And it's interesting that the evolution of what they do. Maybe 20 years ago, these were just you described them as just people really interested. They're not really out for nefarious purposes. Like they just really like to break things and tear them apart and put it together. And then in that process, they would find these vulnerabilities from Microsoft or Apple and other companies, and and report it to these companies, and these that seem to have some kind of adversarial relationship. Companies get mad at them for finding the vulnerabilities and try to punish them. And yet then this kind of market sort of evolved where they would get paid for finding 0 days. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I really, part of this, like I said, was my own learning journey. And I think part of my motivation in writing this book was also to get people to understand that hacker is a misnomer.
Mhm.
Not all hackers are cyber criminals. In fact,
Yeah.
they're just tinkerers. They're the same people you used to see, with their hood up on their cars in their driveway, taking their cars apart and putting them back together, and so for a long time, hackers were hobbyists, and they were just, and they still are to a large degree, taking the software apart, this hardware apart, and seeing how they could possibly use it for some other purpose, good or bad. And many of them, would try and do the right thing and go to the software makers. Originally it was Oracle and Microsoft and HP, uh, and they would say, "Hey, I found this, gaping hole in your software, and it looks like I can use it to break into some of your customers, like NASA." And the response from these companies wasn't "Thank you." It was, "Please stop poking around our software, or
Mhm.
you'll hear from our general counsels." And so that is initially what created this sort of adversarial relationship, and hackers started trading this information. There was a long period of debate that continues to this day about responsible disclosure. And at some point, the US government and other governments said, wait a minute, we've been actually in house here searching for vulnerabilities in software and ways to exploit them so we can spy on our enemies. But why are we doing all of the legwork when clearly there are hackers out there all over the world searching for these holes and trading them in hacker channels online? Why don't we reach out to them and pay them to turn over these holes, and then just require that they never tell anyone, and then we can use it to spy on our enemies
Mhm.
overseas. And they started paying them very good money, holes that you wouldn't think would be worth more than $75 in Microsoft Windows were going for $50,000, in sort of these private government channels. And what was interesting was I knew that, there are 0 day brokers, and I knew that these are the last people who ever want to talk to a journalist, because the minute you're seen as speaking to a journalist, like the Gruck was, with Forbes so many years ago, no one wants to do business with you anymore. You basically get PNG'd in this industry, because no government wants to buy from a 0 day broker that's telling journalists what they're up
Yeah.
to. And so I was really afraid of, will I ever find a 0 day broker who will talk to me, and one from this sort of early period in this industry who could talk me through sort of how this evolved. And I finally found someone who, I had to change his name for the book, but his name is, I call him Jimmy Sabian. And the only reason he talked to me was, one, because I agreed to change his name, but two, because he had become very concerned about sort of the Frankenstein monster that this industry had become. And he said, listen, when I was doing this, when we first started paying hackers, and his stories were incredible. I mean, they were sending middlemen over to Eastern Europe with duffel bags of cash to pay them for a 0 day in Microsoft Windows or some obscure technology that Russian diplomats were using. And then they would come back with it, and they would develop it into an exploit and use it for a number of years. So those stories were incredible. But what he said was, listen, back then we were all predominantly using different technology. We were using one set of technology, our adversaries were using another, but now we're all using the same technology. So when you find a hole in Microsoft Windows or iOS software, Android software, Linux, you're not just leaving it open so you can spy on our enemies, you're leaving it open for Americans and American businesses, and American critical infrastructure too. And the other thing he told me was this thing has gotten so out of control. He said when we started doing this, there were maybe only 3 of us who actually knew what we were doing, who were developing this industry, whatever you want to call it. It's like now there are hundreds, all around the Beltway, and they're not just doing business with our old customers at American government agencies anymore. They're doing business with allies overseas that are using these exploits, these 0 days, to spy on the Ahmed Mansours of the world. And so that's why he eventually sort of opened up. But yeah, this is sort of, it's a story of a hobby gone terribly awry once money came into play.
Yeah, and one of the implications of that is for foreign states, foreign governments with some nefarious intent, and they may not have the hacker talent within their country. They don't need it. They can just, there's a market out there that's largely unregulated, and they can just purchase it for themselves for millions or billions of dollars and wreak havoc on other countries.
Yep. And, it was interesting because a lot of people in this industry are familiar with Zerodium, which is this company now around the Beltway who advertises its price lists, $2.5 million, I think last time I checked, for an iOS remote 0-day exploit, something that can get you into iPhones. But I actually, in the course of reporting my book, found a new broker no one had ever heard of called CrowdFence, that just works with the UAE and the Saudis, and they'll pay you $3 million. I think maybe it's even gone up since then. So we're already getting outbid in this marketplace. So that was a shocker. The other thing was that it wasn't just the tools that were for sale, it was our own elite personnel of hackers. And I tell the story in the book about former TAO hackers at NSA. It's this tailored access operations. This is the division of NSA that's really their hacking teams, who were getting poached from the NSA with promises to quadruple their salaries to go work out of Abu Dhabi. And we're going, and initially they were told, you're just going to be, you're still going to be a part of the war on terror. We're just going to use your skills to track ISIS and Al-Qaeda and targets that we probably wouldn't have a whole lot of moral qualms about them tracking overseas. But very quickly it shifted to, actually, do you think you could hack Qatar, which is another American ally? And, oh, you just got Michelle Obama's emails in this dragnet? That's okay, we'll delete them later. And at that point, Michelle Obama was the first lady of the United States. And it was sort of only then that these former NSA hackers were like, wait a minute, what am I actually doing here? And fully admit that they were incredibly naive. But it just shocked me that it wasn't just 0 days. It was actually, our and best and brightest going overseas and doing this work.
In one part of your book, you talk about one of your hacker sources with a T-shirt that says, someone should do something. Someone should do something. And earlier on in our conversation, you allude to the fact that we all seem to be a little bit desensitized. Data breaches seem so commonplace. We read about them every day in our newspapers and our tech publications. What is that something? What should that something be for government, for companies, and also for lay people, for some of us, those of us on watching this today? What should that be?
So I think we need real carrots and real sticks. We've never had any sticks. I should say, we just had our first stick in the Biden Cyber Executive Order, which is the most comprehensive executive order of its kind. Still an executive order, but one critical clause to pay attention to is how it applies to contractors. And so basically it concedes that we don't have regulation that get critical infrastructure providers up to snuff when it comes to their cybersecurity. So what did this administration do? They said, okay, we can use the power of the purse when it comes to contractors. And so what they said is, listen, we'll rip out the red tape. We'll ask just that you self-certify that you meet these NIST cybersecurity standards. But if we catch you lying to us, you're banned from ever doing business with the federal government again. That is the first stick we have seen in the space, period. And I think a very useful one, because when you think about what happened with Colonial Pipeline, how did a cyber criminal group get the biggest conduit for jet fuel and gas and diesel on the East Coast to shut down the pipeline? They got in because they forgot to deactivate an old employee account whose password had been stolen and they weren't using two-factor authentication.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it took. So, if Colonial Pipeline had self-certified that they met those NIST standards, that they were using two-factor authentication, et cetera, and then they were hit by ransomware and they hadn't, they'd potentially go out of business because they do butt up against federal systems. So it's an interesting stick. I would like to see more, but really I think where it needs to go is carrots, because we are a free market economy. Yeah. And so I think it's a no-brainer that we should offer tax credits to companies that basically subject themselves to a real penetration test, not a compliance checklist, but a real penetration test, and can show over time, through these reports as artifacts, that they have improved or hardened their attack surface. And why not reward them for that? Because there is a cost associated with that. And I think tax credits could be a powerful carrot. Mm-hmm. I think that, for everyday people, I think we have to do a better job communicating that in these breaches, we, the individuals, the employees, continue to be the weakest link. We are still clicking on the phishing emails. We're still not using password managers. We're still not turning on multi-factor authentication. We're not updating our software. And I think on that end, it has to come down to corporate education, hopefully not the kind you can just click through really quickly, like your DMV, training that you have to do when you get a speeding ticket, but something very real. I really appreciate Heather Adkins, who heads up cybersecurity at Google. One of the things she does when people join Google was she walks them through the very painful story from, click on a phishing link to dissident account getting infected that happened with the Aurora Chinese attack on Google in 2009, 2010. And she makes it very real for these new hires and makes it very clear that everyone in the building or hybrid workforce has a critical role to play in defending not just Google, but Google's customers, some of them, Tibetans overseas or Uyghurs overseas. And I think that is critical. I think we need to scale that. We need to figure out how to scale that. And really, I think a useful analogy isn't the digital Pearl Harbor, which I've already put down, but the digital pandemic. Because like the pandemic now, sure, governments need to set policies, businesses will help with vaccines and also setting up their own rules around vaccine mandates or remote workforce. But then individuals, we still need to mask up and socially distance and get vaccinated. And a lot of it comes down to individual behavior. And I think the same thing is true with cybersecurity, but over and over again, what you hear is people saying, well, I don't have anything worth stealing, so I don't really need to worry about this. I don't need to use a password manager. I can, who cares about me? And I think what people don't realize is, okay, maybe you don't have anything important. Maybe you're the most boring person on earth, but you could be a conduit for a hack of your brother or sister, your neighbor, your company, a government agency, a national security threat. And I think people really don't understand that. And that is the education piece.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because we are who we are, and we are a password manager, but our goal is to ensure that everyone has access to the tools that they need to protect themselves online, which is why we offer a fully featured free version. And I love how in your book you say the easiest way to protect ourselves is to use different passwords across different sites and turn on MFA. So Thank you
Yes.
for
And
that PSA.
that latest report you mentioned actually on solar winds from Mandiant, I believe, highlighted that, even MFA isn't perfect, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, we should all be using FIDO keys, which are
Wow.
$20 on Amazon. But for now, it is one of the best defenses because your passwords were all stolen from all those retail hacks I've been covering for the last decade. And so, you can't outsmart hackers when it comes to stolen passwords. The best thing you can do is use a password manager and use
Yeah.
multi-factor authentication. And hopefully at some point, like I say in the book, hopefully one day the password will just go away and we won't have to deal with this anymore. But in the meantime,
Yes.
it is one of your best defenses.
Exactly. So in our last few minutes, Nicole, I wanted to ask you, you announced your departure from the New York Times, and after 10 years of being there. And so thank you for all your reporting over the last decade. What's next for you?
Um, so, it was 10 years last week or 2 weeks ago, and it was just time to do
Yeah.
something else because I really think this past decade is just a glimpse into the cyber threats we'll face over the next decade. And I feel like I've covered every story, and at some point, it's the same old story, just a different target, a different actor,
Mm,
maybe a different method.
yeah.
But overall, it's the same story. And so at a certain point, you get burned out, and it's a little intimidating thinking that you're going to be covering the same story. Only the frequency is going to pick up, the severity is going to pick up, and so I said, okay, I think I could actually. I can't. I can leave the New York Times, but where would I go? To me, the New York Times is still one of the best papers in the world, and there's really no one else I would rather work for. But cybersecurity, as I think most of you know, once you're in it, it's hard to leave because you
Yeah.
start feeling accountable and you start feeling like we all have a role to play using our own unique talents, whether they're technical or as a communicator or agitator or whatever it is, policymaker. Um, and so I would like to try my hand at one of these other roles. And
Yeah.
so the first thing I'll be doing is what I'm doing right now, sitting in a hotel room in DC, waiting to go to my first CISA advisory board meeting. And where I'm really hoping to make an impact is on sort of this education piece around cyber
Mhm.
hygiene. And also, I would like to do what I set out, what I lay out in my epilogue, which is help kind of set up a tour of duty
Mm,
where we get some of our best and brightest to help harden our attack surface here in the United
mhm.
States. And I do feel in some ways I'm in a unique position to do that just because I've developed this incredible network of sources
Yeah.
over the last decade. And I am stationed in Silicon Valley, where we do have some of the best and brightest that have the most to offer in this space. And I also have been covering what how sort of the talent shortage in this space. We have 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity positions worldwide.
Mm,
Anytime I talk to a CIO or CEO, they say we cannot fill these positions.
yeah.
These are so competitive, and the way that China and Russia are working around this is terrifying. Russia is basically tapping into its cyber criminal
Yeah.
networks for some of their operations. China has told its security talent, you can no longer go to these Western hacking conferences like Pwn to Own. And you have to give the state right of first refusal if you find a 0 day. And when we see some of these sophisticated hacks coming from China these days, they're coming from the Ministry of State Security, but it's not within the building. It's sort of this loose network of private contractors that I think moonlight on their behalf. And so we don't do that here in the United States. We don't tap the guy at Palantir or Google on the shoulder and say, tonight you're coming to moonlight with us. We don't have that advantage. And so we are going to have to figure out this recruiting piece. We're going to have to figure out how to get the best and brightest to have these amazing job opportunities at Palantir, at Facebook, at Google, at FireEye, to come work in federal government or to come help our water treatment facilities and dams lock up their systems. And how do we do that? I think the best solution there or the most creative might be some kind of tour of duty.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping to make a difference there
Yeah.
right now.
Well, I definitely look forward to continuing to follow your work in all of this in your next phase of your career. And hopefully, as a company, Bitwarden can continue to be a positive force in providing really accessible security tools for everyone. So our time is up, and Nicole, thank you so much for talking to us. This was really informative, and hopefully will incite all of us to follow what your friend's T-shirt says. You know, someone should do something. I hope this really inspires all of us to think more critically and more seriously about online security. Thank you again for all your years of reporting. I hope you enjoy your time off with your family and your little boy. And thank you. Happy holidays.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And yes, happy holidays, everyone. Hack-free holidays. Yeah, right. But fingers crossed.